12 million African souls. Stolen. 2 million dead before ever seeing land again. What happened in those ships changed the world forever. And what you're about to discover will shake you to your core. Welcome to African Tales by JONA-LORE, where we uncover the untold stories of our ancestors with authenticity and respect. This Black History Month, we're diving deep into one of history's darkest chapters, not to traumatize, but to honor. Not to forget, but to remember. If you're ready to face the truth, to learn what they never taught you in school, and to understand how the world we live in today was built on these very foundations, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You're not just watching content, you're witnessing history that was buried. Let me take you back to the 1500s. Picture the African continent. Thriving kingdoms, advanced civilizations, rich cultures that had existed for millennia. From the Senegambia region to the Gold Coast, from the Bight of Benin to Angola, these were lands of scholars, traders, farmers, and families. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, housed at Emory University, between 1501 and 1866, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes. But here's what most people don't know. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database documents over 35,000 individual voyages. Each voyage represents hundreds of human beings, reduced to cargo. The African Names Database, compiled from courts of mixed commission records, preserves the names of over 91,000 Africans who were liberated from captured slave ships. Names like Amina, Kofi, Zara, Kwame. Real people with real identities that enslavers tried to erase. The journey began long before anyone saw a ship. According to Sowande Mustaqim's research published in Slavery at Sea, in the 18th century, 70% of Africans trafficked were free people snatched directly from their homes and communities. Imagine going about your daily life, farming your land, caring for your children, trading in the marketplace, and suddenly you're ambushed, bound, marched. The forced march to the coast could span dozens, sometimes hundreds of miles. Research documented in the Equal Justice Initiative's report on the transatlantic slave trade reveals that captives were chained together in coffles, walking for weeks under brutal conditions. At the coast, they were imprisoned in barracoons, slave pens and dungeons within fortress-like structures. Places like Elmina Castle in Ghana, Gorée Island in Senegal, and Bunce Island in Sierra Leone still stand today as monuments to this horror. Sometimes, captured Africans waited months in these coastal prisons while ships docked, loading their human cargo. According to the SlaveVoyages Database, maintained by scholars including David Eltis and David Richardson, about 4.5% of deaths occurred during this coastal imprisonment phase. That's over 820,000 people who died before the ship even left Africa. Then came the Middle Passage. Let me share something that brings this into focus. Olaudah Equiano, an 11-year-old boy from the Igbo region of what is now Nigeria, survived the Middle Passage and later wrote the first published slave narrative in 1789. His autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, provides one of the only first-hand accounts we have from someone who endured this journey. When Equiano first saw the slave ship, he wrote that he was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound. He was then taken below deck. Let me read his exact words, because they matter. The stench of the hold was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself. I almost suffocated us. According to data analyzed by historians Herbert Klein and Stanley Engerman in their research on transatlantic mortality, slave ships typically carried between 150 and 450 enslaved Africans, packed at a density of 1.5 to 2.4 people per ton. The ships were purposely designed smaller than cargo vessels to navigate African coastal rivers. But this meant even tighter quarters for the human beings trapped inside. Dr. Alexander Falconbridge, a surgeon who served aboard slave ships in the late 1700s and later became an abolitionist, documented what he witnessed in his 1888 book, An Account of the Slave Trade on the Coast of Africa. He wrote about the exclusion of fresh air being among the most intolerable hardships. The confined air, repeatedly breathed and contaminated by bodily fluids, quickly produced fevers and dysentery that killed thousands. The Statista analysis of slave voyages data reveals that throughout the entire Atlantic slave trade, 14.5% of captured people who embarked on ships died during the crossing. That's approximately 1.8 to 2 million human beings. But mortality rates varied dramatically by era. According to research published in the William and Mary Quarterly, in the early 16th century, death rates averaged around 30%. They decreased to below 20% by the late 17th century and below 15% by the late 18th century. Not because conditions improved, but because shorter voyage times meant less time for disease to spread. The voyage duration varied widely. Journeys between Africa and Brazil averaged 45 days. They had the lowest mortality rate at about 12.5%. Voyages to the Spanish Americas took an average of 78 days and had the highest mortality rate, with almost 1/5 of captives dying en route. But statistics don't tell the full story of the suffering. Equiano described being flogged when he refused to eat. He witnessed brutal cruelty, including hourly whippings for anyone who refused food. The heat below deck was suffocating. The smell, a combination of human waste, vomit, blood, and death, was so overwhelming that even the crew couldn't bear it. Some enslaved Africans chose death over captivity. They jumped overboard despite being shackled. They starved themselves despite being beaten. Resistance took many forms, and according to Mustaqim's research, African women and girls suffered uniquely horrific conditions. Forced to remain naked and segregated from the men, they lived in constant fear of sexual violence from the crew. Historical testimony from Alexander Falconbridge documented that sailors were permitted to indulge their passions among them at pleasure. One account details an 8 to 10-year-old girl who was repeatedly raped by a ship's captain over 3 consecutive nights. Insurrections occurred despite overwhelming odds. Enslaved Africans, weakened and shackled, still attempted to revolt. The crew responded with extreme violence. According to Encyclopedia Virginia's research on slave ships, captains used thumbscrews, whips, and other torture devices to maintain control. In the crux of the whole enterprise, as historian Marcus Rediker noted, was discipline enforced through terror. And the crew? Sailors died too. According to multiple historical analyses, crew mortality rates averaged around 20% during voyages, similar to, or sometimes exceeding, the death rate of enslaved Africans. Disease, particularly malaria and yellow fever, killed sailors. Many crew members were coerced into service, often through debt bondage. They hated the slave trade, but had no choice. Some captains deliberately allowed crew members to die during the return voyage to avoid paying their wages. When ships finally reached the Americas, places like Barbados, Jamaica, South Carolina, or Virginia, the surviving Africans faced yet another trauma. According to the Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade by Eltis and Richardson, approximately 90% of enslaved Africans who survived the Middle Passage arrived in the Caribbean or South America. Only about 388,000, just over 3% of the total, came directly to what would become the United States. But the domestic slave trade within America would later redistribute these populations across the South. Equiano described arriving in Barbados, where he and other survivors were pent up together like so many sheep in a fold, without regard to sex or age. He witnessed families who had survived the Middle Passage together being torn apart during the sale. Brothers sold to different plantations, mothers separated from children. He asked a question that still echoes across centuries. Why are parents to lose their children, brothers their sisters, or husbands their wives? According to the Equal Justice Initiative's comprehensive report, around 80% of enslaved Africans who survived the Middle Passage were forced to work on sugar plantations under conditions so brutal that mortality rates remained extremely high. The work was backbreaking. The hours were endless. The violence was constant. This was genocide continuing on American soil. Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery in Maryland in 1818 and escaped to become one of America's greatest abolitionists, understood the depths of this system. He once wrote words that every American should memorize. "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. I find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them." Douglass also wrote about what slavery required. To make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and, as far as possible, to annihilate the power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. But they did detect inconsistencies. They did resist. They did remember who they were. According to research on Middle Passage cultural retention, enslaved Africans created transatlantic communities in the holds of those ships. Bonds forged in shared suffering. Languages mixed and evolved. Cultural practices adapted but survived. Music, storytelling, to spiritual beliefs, all became weapons of resistance and tools of survival. The transatlantic slave trade was formally abolished by Britain in 1807 and 1808, and by the United States in 1808, though illegal trafficking continued for decades. The last known slave ship to bring Africans to the United States was the Clotilda, which arrived in Mobile, Alabama in 1860. Today, we stand on ground built by enslaved hands. The wealth of the Americas, from the cotton fields of the South to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, from the tobacco farms of Virginia to the rice paddies of the Carolinas, all of it was extracted through the labor, blood, and lives of stolen Africans and their descendants. But the National Endowment for the Humanities notes that 10.7 million people survived the Middle Passage between 1526 and 1866. But when you add those who died during the Middle Passage, those who died in coastal prisons, those who died during the forced march from the interior, and those who died resisting capture, the total death toll directly attributable to the Atlantic slave trade reaches approximately 4 million people between 1500 and 1900. 4 million lives lost. 12.5 million forcibly removed from Africa, destabilizing the entire continent for centuries. An entire hemisphere built on the foundation of this atrocity. This isn't just history. This is heritage. These were real people. They had names. They had families. They had dreams. They were mathematicians and farmers, warriors and healers, mothers and fathers, children with their whole lives ahead of them. When we study the Middle Passage, we're not being divisive. We're being truthful. When we acknowledge this history, we're not dwelling on the past. We're honoring the ancestors whose resilience lives in us today. Every black person in the Americas carries this legacy in their DNA. The legacy of those who survived, who resisted, who refused to let their humanity be stolen even when everything else was taken. I want you to close your eyes for just a moment. Think about 12.5 million people. Think about the ships. Think about the children who cried for parents they'd never see again. Think about the mothers who threw themselves overboard rather than watch their babies sold. Think about the men who plotted revolution even as they starved. Think about the women who sang songs in languages the enslavers couldn't understand, preserving culture through melody. Now open your eyes and remember this. You are the answer to their prayers. Your existence is their victory. Every time you learn this history, every time you share this story, every time you refuse to let them be forgotten, you honor their struggle. Here's what I need from you. Not just a like, not just a subscribe. I need you to think deeply and answer this question in the comments. How do you carry forward the legacy of those who survived the Middle Passage? What does it mean to you personally to be descended from people who endured the unendurable? And for those who aren't of African descent watching this, what responsibility do you believe we all share in ensuring this history is never forgotten and these systems of oppression are never rebuilt? Drop your thoughtful response below. This is Black History Month. This is our history. This is world history. And it matters. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Hit that like button to push this into more feeds. Subscribe to African Tales by JONA-LORE, because we're just getting started. Every story we tell is backed by research, verified by sources, and told with the respect our ancestors deserve. The Middle Passage was real. The horror was real. But so was the resistance. So was the survival. So is the legacy. Never forget. Always remember. Stay blessed.